Why I am a Hindu. Shashi Tharoor served for 29 years at the UN, culminating as Under-Secretary General. He is a Congress MP in India, the author of 14 previous books, and has won numerous literary awards, including a Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Tharoor has a PhD from the Fletcher School, and was named by the World Economic Forum in Davos in 1998 as a global leader of tomorrow. Scribe Pub. One. My Hinduism. Why am I a Hindu? The obvious answer to this question is, of course, that it's because I was born one. Most people have little choice about the faith they grow up with. It was selected for them at birth, by the accident of geography and their parents' cultural moorings. The overwhelming majority of Hindus in the world were born Hindu. A small handful, inspired by marriage, migration, or philosophical conviction, have adopted the faith, usually by a process of conversion unknown to most Hindus. Unlike that small minority, I was never anything else. I was born a Hindu, grew up as one, and have considered myself one all my life. But what does being a Hindu mean? Many of us began having to interrogate ourselves in the late 1980s, when the world media first began to speak and write of Hindu fundamentalism. This was odd, because we knew of Hinduism as a religion without fundamentals, no founder or prophet, no organized church, no compulsory beliefs or rites of worship, no uniform conception of the good life, no single sacred book. My Hinduism was a lived faith. It was a Hinduism of experience and upbringing, a Hinduism of observation and conversation, not one anchored in deep religious study, though of course the two are not mutually exclusive. I knew few mantras, just a few snatches of a couple of hymns and practically no Sanskrit. My knowledge of Hindu sacred texts and philosophies came entirely from reading them in English translation. When I went to a temple, I prayed in an odd combination of English, Sanskrit, and my mother tongue Malayalam, instinctively convinced that an omniscient God would naturally be multilingual. As a student of history, I had always been curious about ancient Indian traditions and beliefs, and I had amassed a rather decent collection of books on the subject of Hindu thought, including multiple translations of the Bhagavad Gita. I had also been a passionate follower of the thoughts and speeches of Swami Vivekananda, as will be apparent in what follows. I had read widely in English about my faith, absorbing the wisdom of Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan and Ananda Kumare Swami, learning about the lives of such notable figures as Swami Vivekananda, Raman Krishna Paramahansa, and Paramahansa Yogananda, and delving into a variety of scholarly studies, from the old classics by A.L. Basham and R. Caesar Enner to the brilliantly interpretative translations and exegeses of Raymond Panikar and Dr. Karan Singh. From these, and others, notably my own father, I had acquired a set of personal convictions that made up my Hinduism. But was that enough, and what did it amount to in the face of a violent new assertion of Hinduness in a form I could not recognize as bearing any relation to my own faith? Defining Hinduism. The first challenge, of course, was definitional. The name Hindu itself denotes something less, and more, than a set of theological beliefs. In many languages, French, and Persian amongst them, the word for Indian is Hindu. Originally, Hindu simply meant the people beyond the river Sindhu, or Indus. But the Indus is now in Islamic Pakistan, and to make matters worse, The word Hindu did not exist in any Indian language till its use by foreigners gave Indians a term for self-definition. Hindus, in other words, call themselves by a label that they didn't invent themselves in any of their own languages, but adopted cheerfully when others began to refer to them by that word. Of course, many prefer a different term altogether, Sanatana Dharma, or eternal faith, which we will discuss later. Hinduism is thus the name that foreigners first applied to what they saw as the indigenous religion of India. It embraces an eclectic range of doctrines and practices, from pantheism to agnosticism and from faith in reincarnation to belief in the caste system. But none of these constitutes an obligatory credo for a Hindu. There are none. We have no compulsory dogmas. This is, of course, rather unusual. A Catholic is a Catholic because he believes Jesus was the Son of God who sacrificed himself for man. A Catholic believes in the Immaculate Conception and the Virgin Birth, offers confession, genuflects in church and is guided by the Pope and a celibate priesthood. A Muslim must believe that there is no God but Allah and that Muhammad is his prophet. A Jew cherishes his Torah or Pentateuch and his Talmud. A Parsi worships at a fire temple. A Sikh honors the teachings of the Guru Granth Sahib above all else. There is no Hindu equivalent to any of these beliefs. There are simply no binding requirements to being a Hindu. Not even a belief in God. I grew up in a Hindu household. Our home always had a prayer room, where paintings and portraits of assorted divinities jostled for shelf and wall space with fading photographs of departed ancestors, all stained by ash scattered from the incense burned daily by my devout parents. I have written before of how my earliest experiences of piety came from watching my father at prayer. Every morning, after his bath, my father would stand in front of the prayer room wrapped in his towel, his wet hair still uncombed, and chant his Sanskrit mantras. But he never obliged me to join him. He exemplified the Hindu idea that religion is an intensely personal matter, that prayer is between you and whatever image of your maker you choose to worship. In the Hindu way, I was to find my own truth, my truth. I think I have. I am a believer, despite a brief period of schoolboy atheism, of the kind that comes with the discovery of rationality and goes with an acknowledgement of its limitations. And I am happy to describe myself as a believing Hindu, not just because it is the faith into which I was born, but for a string of other reasons, though faith requires no reason. One reason is cultural. As a Hindu, I belong to a faith that expresses the ancient genius of my own people. I am proud of the history of my faith in my own land, of the travels of Adi Shankara, who journeyed from the southernmost tip of the country to Kashmir in the north, Gujarat in the west and Odisha in the east, debating spiritual scholars everywhere, preaching his beliefs, establishing his muths, monasteries. I am reaffirmed in this atavistic allegiance by the Harvard scholar Diana Eck writing of the sacred geography of India, knit together by countless tracks of pilgrimage. The great philosopher, President of India, Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, wrote of Hindus as a distinct cultural unit, with a common history, a common literature, and a common civilization. In reiterating my allegiance to Hinduism, I am consciously laying claim to this geography and history, its literature and civilization, identifying myself as an heir, one among a billion heirs, to a venerable tradition that stretches back into time immemorial. I fully accept that many of my friends, compatriots and fellow Hindus feel no similar need, and that there are Hindus who are not, or are no longer, Indian. But I am comfortable with this cultural and geographical Hinduism that anchors me to my ancestral past. But another reason for my belief in Hinduism is, for lack of a better phrase, its intellectual fit. I am more comfortable with the tenets of Hinduism than I would be with those of the other faiths of which I know. I have long thought of myself as liberal, not merely in the political sense of the term, or even in relation to principles of economics, but as an attitude to life. To accept people as one finds them, to allow them to be and become what they choose, and to encourage them to do whatever they like, so long as it does not harm others, is my natural instinct. Rigid and censorious beliefs have never appealed to my temperament. In matters of religion, too, I found my liberal instincts reinforced by the faith in which I was brought up. Hinduism is, in many ways, predicated on the idea that the eternal wisdom of the ages and of divinity cannot be confined to a single sacred book. We have many, and we can delve into each to find our own truth, or truths. As a Hindu, I can claim adherence to a religion without an established church or priestly papacy, a religion whose rituals and customs I am free to reject, a religion that does not oblige me to demonstrate my faith by any visible sign, by subsuming my identity in any collectivity, not even by a specific day or time or frequency of worship. There is no Hindu Pope, no Hindu Vatican, no Hindu Catechism, not even a Hindu Sunday. As a Hindu, I follow a faith that offers a veritable smorgasbord of options to the worshipper, of divinities to adore and to pray to, of rituals to observe, or not, of customs and practices to honor, or not, of fasts to keep, or not. As a Hindu, I subscribe to a creed that is free of the restrictive dogmas of Holy Writ, one that refuses to be shackled to the limitations of a single volume of holy revelation. A Hindu can be astika, pious, or nastika, impious. The terms are said to relate more to orthopraxy, action, rather than orthodoxy, belief, but action proceeds from a set of convictions. As an astika, he can accept the sacredness of the Vedas, the existence of Atman, the soul, and belief in God, or he can reject one or more of these credos and still be Hindu, an adherent of the Nastika variant of Hindu philosophy. As an astika Hindu, he can subscribe to any of the 6 major schools of philosophy, the Shaddarshanas, which I describe later. As a Nastika Hindu, he can declare allegiance to one of 5 schools, including Buddhism and Jainism, which after arising as reform movements against the ritualistic Hinduism of their day, were practically reabsorbed into the parent faith, though their adherents may not see it that way. Or the Nastika can attach himself to the materialist Charvaka school, whose followers denounced most religious practices and devoted themselves to wealth and profit. The palette of options available is as colorful as the most inventive artists. At the same time, as a Hindu, I appreciate the fact that Hinduism professes no false certitudes. Its capacity to express wonder at creation and simultaneously skepticism about the omniscience of the Creator are unique to Hinduism. Both are captured beautifully in this verse from the 3,500-year-old Rig Veda, the Nasadiya Sukta or creation hymn. Then there was neither non-existence nor existence. Then there was neither space, nor the sky beyond. What covered it? Where was it? What sheltered it? Was there water, in depths unfathomed? Then there was neither death nor immortality, nor was there then the division between night and day. That one breathed, breathlessly and self-sustaining. There was that one then, and there was no other. In the beginning there was only darkness, veiled in darkness. In profound darkness, a water without light. All that existed then was void and formless. That one arose at last, born of the power of heat. In the beginning arose desire, that primal seed, born of the mind. The sages who searched their hearts with wisdom, discovered the link of the existent to the non-existent, and they stretched their cord of vision across the void. What was above? What was below? Then seeds were sown and mighty power arose. Below was strength, above was impulse. Who really knows? And who can say? Whence did it all come? And how did creation happen? The gods themselves are later than creation, so who knows truly whence this great creation sprang? Who knows whence this creation had its origin? He, whether he fashioned it or whether he did not. He, who surveys it all from the highest heaven. He knows, or maybe even he does not know. Rig Veda, X.1291. Maybe even he does not know. I love a faith that raises such a fundamental question about no less a supreme being than the creator of the universe himself. Maybe he does not know, indeed. Who are we mere mortals to claim a knowledge of which even he cannot be certain? Hindu thought also makes a virtue out of the unknowability of God. There is a marvelous story in the Upanishads about a sage who is asked to define the nature of God. The wise man, normally loquacious, falls silent. He is pressed by his disciples for an answer, and he replies that that was his answer, for the absolute is silence. The mystery of the divine reality cannot be reduced to words or speech. Neither thought nor words can suffice. It is not understood by those who understand it. Says the Kena Upanishad, it is understood by those who do not understand it. The final words of the Upanishads are, needy, needy, not this, signifying the indescribability of the Absolute. For many sages, their consciousness of the divine is untranslatable to others, for those who have not attained the same realization cannot grasp it through word or sign. It is that of which nothing can be said. And while I am, paradoxically, listing my reasons for a faith beyond understanding, let me cite the fundamental point. Above all, as a Hindu, I belong to the only major religion in the world that does not claim to be the only true religion. I find it immensely congenial to be able to face my fellow human beings of other faiths without being burdened by the conviction that I am embarked upon a true path that they have missed. This dogma lies at the core of the Semitic faiths, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. The Bible contains the words, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father God, but by me. John 14:6. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet, declares the Quran, denying unbelievers all possibility of redemption, let alone of salvation or paradise. Hinduism asserts that all ways of belief are equally valid, and Hindus readily venerate the saints, and the sacred objects, of other faiths. I am proud that I can honor the sanctity of other faiths without feeling I am betraying my own. After all, as the philosopher Raymond Panikar put it so brilliantly in his The Vedic Experience, it is precisely faith that makes thinking possible, for faith offers the unthought ground out of which thinking can emerge. It is faith that makes moral and other decisions possible, opening to us the horizon against which our actions become meaningful. As a Hindu, I seek meaning in my actions within the context of my religious beliefs. A faith without dogma. And yet, Hinduism is a civilization, not a dogma. There is no such thing as a Hindu heresy. Hinduism is a faith that allows each believer to stretch his or her imagination to a personal notion of the creative Godhead of divinity. Hinduism is also a faith that uniquely does not have any notion of heresy in it. You cannot be a Hindu heretic because there is no standard set of dogmas from which you can deviate that make you a heretic. Indeed, not even what one might think of as the most basic tenet of any religion, a belief in the existence of God, is a prerequisite in Hinduism. As I have noted, an important branch of Hindu philosophy, the Charvaka school, goes so far as to embrace atheism within the Hindu philosophical framework. The Charvakas were an interesting example of the intellectual heterodoxy of ancient Hinduism. Not only were they unabashedly materialist, but they challenged the most cherished assumptions of the Astikas. The sage Madhvacharya summarized the Charvaka school in his Sarvadarsana Sangraha as arguing that there is no heaven, no final liberation, no soul, which continues to exist, in another world, nor any ceremonies of castes or orders which are productive of future reward. The Charvakas were in fact contemptuous of holy men and their practices, the Agnihotra sacrifice, the three Vedas, the mendicant's triple staff, Tridanda, and the practice of smearing oneself with ashes, are only means of livelihood ordained by the Creator for men who have neither understanding nor energy. And they were also scathing about the theological claims of Astika philosophers. If it be true that an animal slaughtered at the Jyotis Toma sacrifices in consequence exalted to heaven, they asked, why does the worshipper not immolate his own father, too? Hinduism, in other words, incorporates almost all forms of belief and worship within it. There is no need to choose some or reject others. Mahatma Gandhi famously appreciated this quality of Hinduism. Its freedom from dogma makes a forcible appeal to me, he wrote, inasmuch as it gives the votary the largest scope for self-expression. 3. It is therefore a timeless faith, populated by ideas at once ancient and modern, hosting texts, philosophies, belief systems and schools of thought that do not necessarily all agree with each other. But none has ever been rejected by some supreme authority as beyond the pale. There is no such authority in Hinduism. There can be no Hindu inquisition because there is neither an exacting theology that everyone must subscribe to as holy writ, nor an exalted authority empowered to appoint an inquisitor. Hindu thought is like a vast library in which no book ever goes out of print. Even if the religious ideas a specific volume contains have not been read, enunciated, or followed in centuries, the book remains available to be dipped into, to be revised and reprinted with new annotations or a new commentary whenever a reader feels the need for it. In many cases the thoughts it contains may have been modified by or adapted to other ideas that may have arisen in response. In most, it's simply there, to be referred to, used or ignored as Hindus see fit. Inevitably, though, the question, who is a Hindu, has been asked, and, equally inevitably, political figures have entered the definitional fray. The fighter for Indian independence, Lokmanya, accepted by the people, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, 1856–1920, suggested, in a meeting of the Sanatana Dharma Sabha, Association of Hindus, that a Hindu is he who believes that the Vedas contain self-evident and axiomatic truths for thus seeking to create a religious identity, based on sacred texts, that would be eligible for special consideration from a British colonial regime that had already extended recognition to Muslims, as members of a defined religious community following the dictates of the Quran. 2 decades later Mahatma Gandhi added to Tilak's basic view, writing that Hindus are people who believe in the Vedas, the Upanishads, the multiple Hindu scriptures, the various incarnations of God, rebirth, or reincarnation, varna, caste, and ashrama, the 4 stages of life, which I describe later, and veneration and protection of the cow, and do not express disbelief in idol worship. This is a rather long and contentious list, since many Hindus, myself included, do not subscribe to some of these requirements and do not consider themselves any less Hindu for not doing so. The foundational theorist of the political philosophy of Hindutva, V.D. Savarkar, whose ideas are discussed more fully below, asserted in the 1920s that one could be a Hindu even if one did not recognize the religious authority of the Vedas. 5 To him, the various religious disputes within Hindu religious thought between monism and pantheism, between Dvaita and Advaita, between the Vedas and the Upanishads and even including agnosticism and atheism were irrelevant to the issue of Hindu identity. Savarkar saw Hinduness or Hindutva as opposed to Hinduism as a uniting cultural construct that underlay the identity of all those who belong to Bharatvarsha, the ancient land of India. Unsurprisingly, then, India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, observed that, being a Hindu means all things to all men. Point 6. British civil servant and historian Sir Alfred Lyell described Hinduism as a tangled jungle, full of paradoxes and contradictions, a religious chaos spread all over India, difficult to comprehend and define. No wonder Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan began his celebrated 1926 Upton lectures on Hinduism by asking of his own faith, is it a museum of beliefs, a medley of rites, or a mere map, a geographical expression? 7. As I have argued, one corollary of this eclecticism is the willingness of Hindus to accept other faiths and modes of worship, indeed often embrace them for themselves. It is quite common for Hindus to show reverence to the religious places of other faiths, and to carry relics or sacred objects of other faiths. History is replete with accounts of Hindus thronging Sufi dargahs, Sikh gurudwaras, and Christian shrines, notably the Basilica of Our Lady of Good Health in Velankanni town in Tamil Nadu, which has been described as the Lords of the East, or Mount Mary Church in Mumbai's Bandra, with the same reverence they might express in their own temples. My late father was a devout Hindu who prayed faithfully twice a day, after his baths. He regularly went on pilgrimages to all the major temples and religious sites in our land. When a fire engulfed the Guruvayur temple in the 1960s, he led a fundraising drive in Bombay that saw much of his meager savings diverted to the rebuilding of that shrine. Yet, when a Catholic friend, his life insurance agent, who had made a trip to the Vatican, presented him with an amulet of the Virgin Mary that had personally been blessed by the Pope, he accepted it with reverence and carried it around with him for years. That is the Hinduism most Hindus know, a faith that accords respect and even reverence to the sanctified beliefs of others. This inclination to revere the divine, whatever its source, is a notable Hindu trait, reflecting a traditional unwillingness to succumb to doctrinal absolutism. In his historic speech at Chicago's Parliament of the World's Religions on September 11, 1893, Swami Vivekananda spoke of Hinduism as teaching the world not just tolerance but acceptance. The Swami believed that Hinduism, with its openness, its respect for variety, its acceptance of all other faiths, was one religion that should be able to spread its influence without threatening others. At the Chicago Parliament, he articulated the liberal humanism that lies at the heart of his, and my, creed. I am proud to belong to a religion which has taught the world both tolerance and universal acceptance. We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true. He went on to quote a hymn, the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which he remembered from his formative years at school, as the different streams having their sources in different places all mingle their water in the sea. So, O Lord, the different paths which men take through different tendencies, various though they appear, crooked or straight, all lead to thee. The wonderful doctrine preached in the Bhagavad Gita echoes the same idea, saying, whosoever comes to me, through whatsoever form, I reach him. All men are struggling through paths which in the end lead to me. 9. This was a profoundly important idea, and central to the philosophy Vivekananda was preaching. Tolerance, after all, implies that you have the truth, but will generously indulge another who does not. You will, in an act of tolerance, allow him the right to be wrong. Acceptance, on the other hand, implies that you have a truth but the other person may also have a truth, that you accept his truth and respect it, while expecting him to respect, and accept, your truth in turn. This practice of acceptance of difference, the idea that other ways of being and believing are equally valid, is central to Hinduism and the basis for India's democratic culture. I challenge the world to find, Vivekananda proudly declared in a different speech in Chicago, throughout the whole system of Sanskrit philosophy, any such expression as that the Hindu alone will be saved and not others. Says Vyasa, We find perfect men even beyond the pale of our caste and creed. 10. One of Hinduism's great strengths, though there are some who see this as a weakness, is its lack of prescriptive tenets. The faith assumes that different people require different pathways to the ultimate. Even within Hinduism, there is no desire to require the same things of all people, it being accepted that people of different spiritual and intellectual attainments will employ different routes in seeking the divine, multiple divinities. As a result, Hindus allow themselves to worship the divine in multiple forms, the 333 million gods of legend. Some versions say 33 million, 300 million, and 330 million. Even here we are flexible, are in fact merely a reflection of the infinite aspects of divinity. While other faiths tend to personify the idea of God, seeing him in anthropomorphic terms as a man-like being, the Hindu idea of God is both simpler and more complicated. God, to the Hindu, is everywhere, a presence and an absence, within us and outside us. God transcends both time and space. God has no beginning and no end, but equally has no shape and no form. God can therefore be imagined in myriad ways, and in all conceivable shapes and forms, since there is nowhere that God is not, and nowhere that God cannot be. The highest form of God is the Brahman, the Absolute, the universal soul that suffuses all creation, as a verse in the Maitreya Upanishad puts it. In the beginning everything was Brahman. He was one, and infinite, infinite in the east, infinite in the south, infinite in the west, infinite in the north, above and below and everywhere infinite. East and the other regions do not exist for him, nor across, nor below, nor above. The highest self is not to be fixed. He is unlimited, unborn, not to be reasoned about, not to be conceived. He is like the ether, everywhere, and at the destruction of the universe, he alone is awake. Then from that ether he wakes all this world, which consists of thought only, and by him alone is all this meditated on, and in him it is dissolved. His is that luminous form which shines in the sun, and the manifold light in the smokeless fire, and the fire in the stomach which consumes the food. Thus it is said, he who is in the fire, and he who is in the heart, and he who is in the sun, they are one and the same. 11. One of the most famous dialogues in Hindu philosophy, from the Chandogya Upanishad, relates to a discussion between a rishi, sage, and his son about the existence of God. The young man, Svetakata, asks his father, Uddalaka Aruni, how he can demonstrate that God exists when there is no visible proof of God's existence. In the typical Hindu manner of instruction, Uddalaka asks his son to fetch a fruit from the banyan tree and cut it open. Inside the fruit, the son finds a small seed. The father asks him to break it apart and see what there is in it, but the seed is all there is. Uddalaka tells his son that all he can see is a small seed, yet something exists in that seed that is so powerful that an immense banyan tree can grow out of it. Similarly, God is not visible, but exists, and the world has grown out of God. The son is only partly persuaded, so the father asks him to mix salt and water in a bowl. Now, he tells Svetakata, taste the water and the salt in different parts of the bowl, and once you have done so, separate the salt from the water. The son does as instructed, and points out that the water in every part of the bowl tastes equally salty, and that once dissolved, the salt cannot be separated from the water. Aha, says Uddalaka, you find the salt all-pervasive in the bowl, so too is the universal spirit, which is all-pervasive in creation. When, at the end of our lives, we human beings merge with Brahman, we cannot be separated from it any more than the salt can from the water in your bowl. Since God is everywhere and in everything, this all-pervasive universal spirit is nirguna, without qualities, without shape, and without gender. Hindus cannot refer to Nirguna Brahman as he, since God can be and is also she and it. The Vedas use the interrogative pronoun ka, who, or more precisely kasmai, to whom, for the unknowable God. The impersonal pronoun often used in Sanskrit for God is tat, that in English, in other words, that which exists. Hindu meditation begins with the words, Om Tat Sat, Om, the primordial sound that encompasses past, present and future, Tat, that which exists, Sat, truth. The Chandogya Upanishad tells the story of Svetakatod, who is taught metaphysics by his father in a series of lessons that each end with the statement, Tat Tivam Asi, that you are the same as the Brahman that pervades the cosmos. As the Hiranyagarbha hymn in the Rig Veda asks, O Father of the earth, by fixed laws ruling, O Father of the heavens, pray protect us. O Father of the great and shining waters, what God shall we adore with our oblation? Rig Veda, I.121.912. But the sages realized that all this was rather abstruse, and would be difficult for the average human being to comprehend. The Nirguna Brahman was a philosophical concept at the heart of Hinduism, but people needed to worship something they could imagine and visualize. Hence the idea of the Saguna Brahman, the absolute given form, qualities, and attributes, also known as Ishvara or Bhagwan. Strictly speaking, Ishvara is the best translation of God in the Christian or Allah in the Muslim sense of these terms, since those faiths have no equivalent for God in the sense of Brahman. But the Hindu Ishvara takes multiple forms. There is the trinity of Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva or Mahesh, the destroyer, all different manifestations of the God principle, and their myriad manifestations, plus their avataras, consorts, and companions, who may all be worshipped depending on the preferences of the devotee. The Avatara doctrine, under which these gods manifested themselves in different, recognizable human-like forms, such as Rama or Krishna, also had the distinct advantage of permitting the worshipper to venerate a personal god without this involving any rupture with the mainstream corpus of Hindu thought, which emphasized the impersonal formless aspect of divinity and insisted on needy. The unknowable Nirguna Brahman, after all, becomes all the more knowable when it takes human form as an avatara. The abstraction of Hindu philosophic thought becomes more accessible in the form of a recognizable figure. The idea of the avatara responded to the popular demand for devotion to personal gods, and to their recurrence in the life of the believer. As Krishna says in the Gita, 4:7-8, whenever righteousness declines in the world and unrighteousness arises, I return to earth. For the deliverance of good, the destruction of evil and the re-establishment of Dharma, I am reborn from time to time. At the same time, it is remarkable how the 10 avataras of Vishnu, the Dasavataras, seemingly chart the course of human evolution 2 millennia before Darwin, starting with Matsya, the fish, and proceeding successively through Kurm, the tortoise, Varha, the boar, and Narasimha, the half-man half-lion, to more recognizable human forms, Vamana, the dwarf, and Parasurama, who wields a great axe, then perfect men who are worshipped as divine, Sri Rama and Sri Krishna, then the Buddha, an interesting inclusion, of which more later, and finally Kalki, who is yet to be born, a brilliant youth on a white steed with a devastating sword, encircled by flames, who represents the destruction of the world as we know it. Some speak simplistically of the Holy Trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva as 3 separate gods, but all 3 are in fact 3 sides of one complex being, aspects of the Uttama Purusha, the perfect personality. There is a God who created the gods, and the demons Prajapati, Lord of all creatures. There are multiple further manifestations of the divine in popular Hindu iconography, a myriad of gods and goddesses. This might well have resulted from the Vedic civilization's absorption of the tribal and folk deities it found being worshipped in India before its advance through the country. Each local manifestation of a god or a goddess was included in the all-embracing Hindu pantheon, so that as Hinduism spread, it accommodated earlier forms of worship rather than overthrowing them. Similarly, many tribes revered animals, but instead of disrespecting them, Hinduism absorbed the non-humans too, by making them the companions or vehicles, vahanas, of the gods. So Vedic gods found themselves riding a lion, mounting a peacock, reclining on a swan, or sitting on a bull. It was part of the agglomerative nature of Hinduism that it neither rejected nor dismissed the faiths it encountered, but sought to bring them into the fold in this way. Hinduism, therefore, has given birth to a rich iconography, varying according to the specific divine form and further according to the role in which that divinity is depicted, whether at a peaceful moment or in an attack upon evil, for instance, or whether as himself or transformed for a specific purpose. Vishnu, for instance, became half man half lion, Narasimha, to kill a demon who could not be killed by a human. While the iconography of Shiva, Vishnu and the remover of obstacles, the elephant-headed Ganesha, is well known, every depiction of Ishvara, in whichever form, involves certain symbolic images and attributes, and the images of these gods were configured to embody profound conceptions of the universe, from the subduing of ignorance and the defeat of evil to the harmonies of destruction and regeneration. Thus Brahma, the creator, is always shown with 4 heads, facing all 4 directions, as befits the creator of the universe. He holds the Vedas in his hand, a prayer vessel beside him, and sits on a lotus, the favored flower in Hindu iconography since it remains pure and unsoiled by the mud and dirt from which it emerges. His consort is Sarasvati, goddess of learning and wisdom, who is always depicted holding the musical instrument the veena, symbolizing the music of the cosmos, the inner sound of Om from which the universe emerged. She has rosary beads in one hand to signify the importance of prayer and meditation, and palm leaf scrolls in another, to epitomize learning. She too sits on a lotus, but sometimes on a peacock, a symbol of the ego that should be suppressed in the pursuit of true knowledge, and her vahana, or vehicle, is the graceful swan. Brahma is rarely worshipped. There are barely a handful of temples dedicated to him, the most remarkable at Pushkar in Rajasthan, but Sarasvati is ubiquitous, widely honored, and portrayed, and there is a specific day devoted each year to her exaltation, Sarasvati Puja, whereas there is none to Brahma. That she is merely a consort to one of the Holy Trinity is irrelevant to her importance. Hinduism cannot entirely be absolved of gender bias, but its reverence for the female principle in the Godhead is exemplary. No better example of this exists than the many manifestations of the goddess in the form of Shakti, which literally means strength, the power of the life force that creates, nurtures, sustains, and also destroys the world. The goddess is seen as a source of energy, without which the male aspect of the Godhead would be ineffectual. This female energy takes many forms. As Sarasvati, she embodies learning, as Lakshmi, wealth, and prosperity. As Uma or Parvati, she is Shiva's gentle Ardhangani, his half, as inseparable from the Lord as fire and heat, or Purusha, the spirit, and Prakriti, matter, are inseparable. As Kamakshi or Rajarajeshvari, she is the Great Mother. As Durga, she rides a tiger, bearing weapons to fight the 8 evils of humankind: greed, hate, envy, contempt for others, passion, vanity, jealousy, and illusion. In her most frightening form she is Kali, the personification of time, Kala, dark, angry and armed, weapons flailing, her body dripping with blood, wearing the skulls of her victims, sometimes holding aloft the severed head of one or grinding her foot into the prone body of another. If that sounds macabre, there are 51 Shakti Pithas, temples to the goddess, across India, each consecrated to a body part of Shiva's first wife, Sati, whose body was said to have been dismembered in 51 pieces by the flying Sudarshana Chakra weapon of Lord Vishnu. Sati had killed herself during a fire sacrifice conducted by her father, and her disconsolate husband was carrying her body around in grief and mourning. Vishnu's act was intended to get Shiva to snap out of it. Sati was duly reincarnated as Parvati. There are temples where the goddess retreats into seclusion for 3 days a month to menstruate, as in Chengannur in Kerala, others where Devi's footprint, on stone, alone is worshipped. My home state of Kerala overflows with temples to the goddess, often referred to simply as Devi or Bhagavati, both of which simply mean the goddess, though the most popular form of Bhagavati worship is of the goddess as Bhadrakali, a form of Kali. One temple in Thiruvananthapuram, the Adikal Bhagavati temple, is listed in the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest gathering of women in one place at one time, millions, 2.5 million in 2009, a record that is broken every year, with 4.5 million reported in 2017, assemble each February for the Pongala, at which offerings are cooked and prepared for the goddess. There is a marvelous Puranic story about the birth of Durga. It is said that a terrible buffalo-headed demon, Mahishasura, had succeeded in conquering all the gods, or devas, and established himself as the master of all creation. The gods, despairing in defeat, retreated to a conclave under Lord Indra to find a solution. They decided to pool their strengths, each contributing a particular weapon or personal attribute, and when they had made their contributions and due rituals had been conducted, a dazzling light engulfed the universe from which emerged a fierce female warrior, riding a snarling tiger, wielding a weapon in each of her 18 arms. She engaged in furious and bloody battle with Mahishasura for 9 days and 9 nights, at the end of which she vanquished him. These 9 days and nights are celebrated annually by Hindus as the 9-day Navaratri festival, which celebrates the defeat of terrible evil by the forces of good, though interestingly, some fringe groups have started to commemorate Mahishasura instead, claiming he is the symbol of the indigenous Adivasis, tribal peoples, vanquished by the civilizing onslaught of the mainstream Hindus. The various manifestations of Devi suggest that Hinduism took on board multiple goddess-worshipping cults. Kali seems to have been a pre-Vedic goddess converted by the Hindus into one more form of Shakti. Sometimes the same figures in Hindu texts have different genders. Vishnu famously adopted a female form for specific purposes. A female form of Ganesha, now little worshipped, was depicted as Vinayaki or Ganeshvari. In the Mahabharata, Arjuna becomes Arjuni, female, and Brihanala, of the third gender, without losing his masculine valor. Indeed, the Madurai temple has sculptures of him in all 3 forms. Similarly, Hanuman, a monkey god, was enlisted in the service of Lord Rama in the epic Ramayana. Scholars see in his appearance the absorption of animist nature worship into Vedic Theism, and the accommodation of South Asia's indigenous peoples into the Hindu fold. Characters depicted in the epics as animals with anthropomorphic characteristics may in fact have been Adivasis. Hanuman was perhaps the leader of a monkey totem Adivasi tribe, Jataya that of a vulture totem tribe, and Jambuvan of a tribe using bear totems. 13. Another interesting example is that of the god Jagannath in Odisha, famous for his Radha or chariot. It's a beautiful, elaborately carved wooden vehicle used for a sanctified purpose to wheel an image of a deity worshipped by millions to a temple in full public view, but it has given its name to the English word, Juggernaut. The word is a colonial mangling of Jagannath, Sanskrit for Lord of the World, a manifestation of the god Krishna. Legend has it that in ancient times, King Indradyumna chanced upon the corpse of Lord Krishna, who had been slain by a hunter, and was informed by the god Vishnu that he should make a wooden statue of the Lord and inter his bones in it. The great sage Vishvakarma, the architect of the gods, undertook the task on condition that he not be disturbed while carving the statue. When, after 15 days, the impatient king went to inquire about the progress of the sculpture, the irritated sage abandoned it unfinished, without hands or feet. King Indradyumna prayed to Brahma, the creator, who breathed life into the statue by giving it eyes and a soul, though he could do nothing about the stumps where the deity's limbs should have been. This consecrated statue is worshipped at the Jagannath temple in Puri, in the eastern state of Odisha. The legend almost certainly masks a different story. As I have noted, as Hinduism spread through the subcontinent, it absorbed local animist and tribal faiths it encountered, by accommodating their images of worship into the Hindu pantheon. Jagannath was probably a tribal god who was reimagined, through this legend, as a manifestation of Krishna, himself an incarnation of Vishnu, his somewhat rough and limbless appearance explained through an elaborate story that fits within Hindu lore. One of the ways of ensuring the new deity's acceptance by the people was by parading him 4 times a year in elaborate yatras, journeys, on land and water, of which the most famous is the Ratha, chariot, yatra, or chariot procession, in the month of Ashadha, according to the Hindu calendar, roughly mid-June to mid-July in the Gregorian. This is when the idol is wheeled to the temple in an enormous chariot as devotees line the streets in a frenzy, hailing the Lord with chants and prayers and craning their necks for a glimpse of the deity seated in the chariot, followed by lesser chariots bearing statues of his brother Balrama and sister Subhadra. How did the deity transported in this devotional procession become transmogrified into an English term for a relentless, remorseless, unstoppable force that destroys anything in its path? Orientalism began early, alas, 4 centuries before the British conquest of India. Fantastical tales about India were propagated in the 14th century travelogue of Sir John Mandeville, who described the festival in his travels and depicted Hindus throwing themselves under the wheels of the enormous Jagannath chariots as a religious sacrifice and being crushed to death. Hinduism, in fact, has no concept of such human sacrifice. If Sir John really saw a Hindu killed under the wheels of a chariot, it can only be because a poor devotee stumbled and fell accidentally upon the path in the tumult and the enormous chariot could not easily stop or turn on the narrow road. Still, the tale, the false image of the faith it portrayed, and the unfortunate associations of the word persisted. By the 18th century, Juggernaut was in common use as a synonym for an irresistible and destructive force that demands total devotion or unforgiving sacrifice, the sense in which it pops up in the novels of Charlotte Bronte and Charles Dickens, and even Robert Louis Stevenson, who applied it to Dr. Jekyll's foil, Mr. Hyde. It was only Mark Twain, in his autobiography, who described Juggernaut as the kindest of gods, and a look at the lovely model of an 18th century Radha in the British Museum's collection shows you why, for such an exquisite piece of art would only have been used to transport a figure of reverence, not of fear. But alas, by then the damage had been done. But I digress. Hinduism did not stop with the absorption of earlier animist or tribal religions. It accepted the precepts of Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, treating his followers as a special sect of Hindus rather than as a separate faith. When Buddhism sought to reform Hinduism, Hinduism turned around and sought to absorb it too, by including the Buddha as a reincarnation of Vishnu and his agnostic teachings as merely a Nastika form of the mother faith. As a result, Buddhism has hardly any strength or presence in the land of its birth, having been absorbed and overtaken by the religion it sought to challenge. Hinduism could well have tried the same with Christianity and Islam, too, had it been allowed to do so, but these faiths were not interested in being embraced by Hinduism, since they saw themselves as the revealed truth rather than as one among multiple versions of truth. Hinduism is also unusual in seeing God, man, and the universe as correlated. As the philosopher Raymond Panikar has explained, in Hindu thought, God without man is nothing, literally nothing. Man without God is just a thing, without meaning, or larger purpose, and the universe without man or God is anything, sheer chaos, devoid of existence. In Panikar's explanation, nothing separates man from God, there is neither intermediary nor barrier between them. So Hindu prayers mix the sacred with the profane. A Hindu can ask God for anything. Among the tens of thousands of sacred verses and hymns in the Hindu scriptures are a merchant's prayer for wealth, a bankrupt's plea to the divine to free him of debt, verses extolling the union of a man with a woman, and even the lament of a rueful and luckless gambler asking God to help him shake his addiction. Prayer and worship, for the Hindu, are thus not purely spiritual exercises. They enhance the quality of his life in the material world, in the here and now. Ganesh, my Ishtadevta. Hindus are often asked, during certain ritual prayers, to imagine their Ishtadevta, their personal god, or rather that way of imagining the abstraction of the absolute in an anthropomorphic form that most appeals to them. I pick Ganesh or Ganapati, as we prefer to call him in the South myself, not because I believe God looks like him, but because of the myriad aspects of the Godhead, the ones he represents appeal most to me. Om Mahaganapath Namangha. Sarva Vinyabhashante. Om Gainshaya Namangha. Every morning, for longer than I can remember, I have begun my day with that prayer. I learned it without being fully aware what all the Sanskrit words meant, knowing only that I was invoking, like millions of Hindus around the world, the name of the great elephant-headed god to bless all my endeavors to come. Ganesh sits impassively on my bedroom shelf, in my office, in my living room and my dining room, as well as my prayer alcove, in multiple forms of statuary, stone, metal, and papier-mâché. There is nothing incongruous about this. He is used to worse, appearing as he does on innumerable calendars, posters, trademarks and wedding invitation cards. Paunchy, long-trunked, though with one broken tusk, attired in whatever costume the artist fancies, from ascetic to astronaut, Ganesh, riding his way across Indian hearts on a rat, is arguably Hinduism's most popular divine figure. Few auspicious occasions are embarked upon without first seeking Ganesh's blessing. His principal attribute in Hindu mythology, a quality that flows from both his wisdom and his strength, is as a remover of obstacles to the fulfillment of desires. No wonder everyone wants Ganesh on their side before launching any important project, from starting a factory to acquiring a wife. My own student day courtship violated time-honored Indian rules about caste, language, region, age, and parental approval, but when we got married, my then wife-to-be and I had an embossed red Ganesh adorning the front of our wedding invitations. I have since developed an even more personal connection to Ganesh. The great 2,000-year-old epic, the Mahabharata, was supposedly dictated by the sage Veda Vyasa to Ganesh himself. Since then, many a writer has found it helpful to invoke Ganesh in his epigraph. When I recast the characters and episodes of the Mahabharata into a political satire on 20th century Indian history, the Great Indian Novel, 1989, I had it dictated by a retired nationalist, Ved Vyas, to a secretary named Ganapati, with a big nose and shrewd, intelligent eyes, who enters with elephantine tread, dragging an enormous trunk behind him. Such are the secular uses of Hindu divinity. For in my Hinduism the Godhead is not some remote and forbidding entity in the distant heavens. God is immediately accessible all around us, and he takes many forms for those who need to imagine him in a more personalized fashion. The Hindu pantheon includes thousands of such figures, great and small. Ganesh is the chief of the Ganas, or what some scholars call the inferior deities. 14 He is not part of the trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, who are the principal Hindu gods, the three facets of the ultimate first cause. But he is the son of Shiva, or at least of Shiva's wife, Parvati. One theory is that she shaped him from the scurf of her own body, without paternal involvement. As a writer, I have always been interested in the kinds of stories a society tells about itself. So part of the appeal of Ganesh for me lies in the plethora of stories about how this most unflappable of deities lost his original head and acquired his unconventional appearance. The most widely held version is the one my grandmother told me when I was little, about the time that Parvati went to take a bath and asked her son to guard the door. Shiva arrived and wished to enter, but Ganesh would not let him in. Enraged by this effrontery, Shiva cut off the boy's head. Parvati, horrified, asked him to replace it, and Shiva obliged with the head of the first creature he could find, an elephant. This was a salutary lesson in the perils of excessive obedience to your parents, though I don't think my grandmother intended me to take it that way. My mother, who always tried unsuccessfully to resist the temptation to boast about her children, had another version. A vain Parvati asked Shani, Saturn, to look at her perfect son, forgetting that Shani's gaze would reduce the boy's head to ashes. Once again, an elephant's was the head that came to hand. Growing up in an India where loyalty seems all too often on sale to the highest bidder, I could not but be impressed by Ganesh's rare quality of stubborn devotion to duty. However he may have lost his head, it was Ganesh's obduracy as a guard that, in my grandmother's telling, cost him a tusk. The powerful avatar Parasurama, she recounted, as we little ones gathered round her at dusk, possessor of many a boon from Shiva, came to call on the great destroyer at his abode of Mount Kailash. Once again, Ganesh was at the door, and he refused to let the visitor disturb the sleeping Shiva. Parasurama, furious, tried to force his way in, but found Ganesh a determined opponent. My eyes widened in excitement at this part. Ganesh picked Parasurama up with his long trunk, swung him round and round till he was dizzy and helpless, and threw him to the ground. When his head cleared, Parasurama flung his axe at the obstinate Ganesh. Now Ganesh could have easily avoided the axe, but he recognized the weapon as one of Shiva's. He could not insult his father by resisting his weapon. So he took the axe humbly upon his tusk. Ever since, Ganesh has been depicted with only one full tusk, the other half amputated by the axe. The thrill of that story did not diminish for me when I learned the more prosaic version, which says that Ganesh wore down one tusk to a stub by using it to write down the epic verse of the Mahabharata. For this reason, the missing tusk signifies knowledge. As I grew older, I learned of more such symbols associated with Ganesh. Scholars of Hinduism tell us that Ganesh's fat body represents the hugeness of the cosmos, its combination of man and pachyderm signifying the unity of the microcosm, man, with the macrocosm, depicted as an elephant. Some suggest it has the less esoteric purpose of demonstrating that appearances mean little, and that an outwardly unattractive form can hide internal spiritual beauty. In any case, his looks do not prevent Ganesh, in most popular depictions, from being surrounded by beautiful women, including his twin wives, Sthi and Budhai. Sthi represents spiritual power and Budhai intellect. In some versions there is a third wife, Rudhi, embodying prosperity, though she usually replaces Budhai, perhaps making the point that you can have either brains or wealth but not both. Further, Ganesh's trunk can be curled into the symbol Om, the primal sound, and the snake found coiled around his waist represents the force of cosmic energy. But Amma, I would ask my grandmother, why does Ganesh ride a rat? For in most of the pictures in our prayer room, the deity is shown on this unusual mount. At the simplest level, the sight of an elephantine god on a tiny mouse visually equates the importance of the greatest and smallest of God's creatures. And, as my grandmother explained, each animal is a symbol of Ganesha's capacities. Like an elephant, he can crash through the jungle uprooting every impediment in his path, while like the rat he can burrow his way through the tightest of defenses. A god who thus combines the attributes of elephant, mouse, and man can remove any obstacle confronting those who propitiate him. No wonder that many worship him as their principal deity, despite his formerly more modest standing in the pantheon. And what is the secret of his appeal to a 21st century urbanite like myself? As his unblinking gaze and broad brow suggest, Ganesh is an extremely intelligent god. When I was very young, I heard the story of how Parvati asked her two sons, Ganesh and Kartikeya, to go around the world in a race. Kartikeya, the more vigorous and martial-minded of the two, set off at once, confident he would encircle the globe faster than his corpulent brother. Ganesh, after resting a while, took a few steps around his mother and sat down again. Parvati reminded him of her challenge. "But you are my world," Ganesh disarmingly replied, "and I have gone around you." Needless to say, he won the race in my unqualified admiration. So it is no surprise that Ganesh is worshipped in India with not just reverence but enthusiasm. Sometimes this can be carried to extremes, as when Ganesh devotees in western India in the 1890s allowed the bubonic plague to take many lives rather than cooperate with a British campaign to exterminate the rats that carried it, for the rats were also, after all, Ganesh's mounts. Or when, in late September 1995, word spread around the world that statues of Ganesh had begun drinking milk. In some cases, statues of his divine parents, Shiva and Parvati, were also reported to be imbibing these liquid offerings, but Ganesh it was who took the elephant's share. In India, the rationalists were quick to react. It was, they averred, a matter of simple physics. Molecules on the rough stone and marble surfaces of the statues had created a capillary action, which sucked in the droplets of milk. Capillary action Iyanamangha. These were not really absorbed into the statue but formed a thin layer of droplets on the surface which would be visible if the statue were dark. A team of government scientists proceeded to demonstrate this on television, placing green powder in the milk and showing a green stain spreading over the face of a white marble statue. Mass hysteria was alleged. Indian priests, who live off the offerings of devotees in the temples, were merely trying to whip up more custom, said some. It was all politics, said others, pointing to the need for the then flagging Hindutva movement to attract the credulous to their credo. The Pioneer newspaper published a photograph of a spout emerging from the back of a temple from which milk poured into a bucket. 15. The implication was that it was chicanery, not divine ingestion, that accounted for the disappearing milk in the temples. Still, millions of devotees who flocked to temples worldwide saw in the phenomenon a simple message from the heavens that the gods remained interested in the affairs of ordinary mortals. But Hindus have always believed that to be the case. The milk miracle merely reinforced an unstated assumption about the nature of the Godhead. Our gods crowd the streets, smile or frown on us from the skies, jostle us for space on the buses. They are part of our daily lives, as intimate and personal as the towels in which we wrap ourselves after a bath. As MP for Thiruvananthapuram, Trivandrum, in Kerala, I was struck by the fact that my constituency is the one place in the world where even the airport runway shuts down twice a year for a few hours so that Lord Padmanabhaswamy can be escorted on his usual traditional route across the airfield for his ritual seaside bath. And none in the city, of any faith, considers this remotely unusual. So the intrusion of the gods into our lives through the milk-drinking episode is no great aberration. They are part of our lives anyway, we see ourselves in them, only idealized. My own affection is for Ganesh himself, a god who overweight, long-nosed, broken-tusked, and big-eared cheerfully reflects our own physical imperfections. After all, a country with many seemingly insurmountable problems needs a god who can overcome obstacles. When I was a child in Bombay, I was enraptured once a year by the city's great Ganesh Chaturthi festival, in which India's bustling commercial capital gives itself over to the celebration of this many-talented deity. Hundreds of statues of Ganesh are made, decorated, and lovingly dressed. Then they are taken out across the busy city streets and amid endless processions of followers, who collectively number over 1 million. Before being floated out to sea in a tour of release. As a little boy I stood on the beach watching the statues settle gradually into the water while the streams of worshippers dispersed. It was sad to see the giant elephant heads disappear beneath the waves, but I knew that Ganesh had not really left me. I would find him again, in my wall calendars, on my mantelpiece, at the beginning of my books and in the prayers with which I would resume my life the morning after the festival. Om Mahaganapath Namangha, Sarva Vinyabhashante, Om Gainshaya Namangha, Om, I invoke the name of Ganapati, bringer of peace over all troubles. Om, I invoke the name of Ganesh. 2. The Hindu way. The sage Yajnavalkya was once asked to list the number of gods. It is said he began with the number 3,300 and ended by reducing them all to one Brahman, the pervasive spirit of the cosmos that underlies all creation. The Rig Veda say, Ekam Sat Viprabhahadha Vadanti. This was also Swami Vivekananda's favorite phrase about spirituality, that which exists is one. The sages call it by various names. Hindus therefore understand that all worship of God reflects an effort to reach out to that which cannot be touched or seen, since God is, in that sense, literally unknowable. One may imagine him/her/it in any form, since each form may be just as valid as another and none can be guaranteed to be more accurate than the next one. The various forms of God in Hinduism, reducing the abstract to the specific visual form, reflect the limitations of the human imagination rather than any shapes within which the divine must be confined. Indeed, Hindu legends have the gods manifesting themselves in so many shapes and forms that the notion of one agreed image of God would be preposterous. Thus one can imagine God as a pot-bellied man with an elephant head, and also as a 10-armed woman with a beatific smile, and since both forms are equally valid to the worshipper, why not also imagine God as a bleeding man on a cross? All are acceptable to the Hindu. The reverence accorded to each representation of the unknowable God by worshippers of other faiths is enough to prompt similar respect from the Hindu. Acceptance is always the name of the game. As I have remarked at the outset, the key to understanding Hinduism is that it is one faith that claims no monopoly on the truth. Hindus understand that theirs may not necessarily be the only path that leads to salvation. They are taught to respect all other paths that seek the truth, knowing that these will vary depending on the circumstances of each individual's life, the culture in which they are born or live, their values and motivations. In the Gita, Lord Krishna says, "Whosoever follows any faith and worships me under whatsoever denomination in whatsoever form with steadfastness, his faith I shall reinforce." Point 1. The acknowledgement of multiple paths to the ultimate truth of creation is implicit in the philosophical disputes and arguments that have marked the faith for millennia. One consequence of this acceptance of difference is that it flies in the face of the certitudes most other religions assert. The French traveler François Berny, on his well-documented journey through India in the 17th century, tried to introduce some Brahmins in 1671 to Christianity, and was startled by their response. They pretended not that their law was universal, that God had only made it for them, and it was, therefore, they could not receive a stranger into their religion, that they thought not our religion was therefore false, but that it might be it was good for us, and that God might have appointed several different ways to go to heaven, but they will not hear that our religion should be the general religion for the whole earth, and there's a fable and pure device too. We respect your truth, the Brahmins were saying, please respect ours. Some scholars have described Hindus as henotheists, that is, people who worship their god but do not deny the existence of other gods. Every Hindu worships some god, but it may not be the same god worshipped by every other Hindu either. As Radhakrishnan puts it, God is more than the law that commands, the judge that condemns, the love that constrains, the father to whom we owe our being, or the mother with whom is bound up all that we can hope for or aspire to. 3. God is all that, and infinitely more. This henotheistic attitude means, however, undifferentiated respect for all the various possible ways of worshipping God, whether Hindu or not. A Hindu can accept the worship of the Abrahamic God as another practice of the same kind as he sees pursued by other Hindus. For him, someone worshipping Christ is essentially no different from himself worshipping Vishnu or Shiva. The acceptance of difference starts here for the Hindu. This was why it was possible for a large community of Jews, the Bani Israel, after arriving on the shores of western India around the time of Christ, to practice their faith for centuries in rural Maharashtra without being seen by their Hindu neighbors as practitioners of a different religion. Hindus used to seeing various Hindus pursue their own modes of devotion found nothing odd in a people with their own different practices, assuming them to be just another kind of Hindu, until a wandering rabbi from Jerusalem arrived in India centuries later and identified them as the Jews they were. It didn't matter to the Hindus around them. The Haristati has a prayer that says, May Vishnu, the ruler of the 3 worlds, worshipped by the Shaivites as Shiva, by the Vedantins as Brahman, by the Buddhists as the Buddha, by the Naiyayikas as the chief agent, by the Jainas as the liberated, by the ritualists as the principle of Dharma, may he grant our prayers. For this cheerful eclecticism was the attitude that enabled Swami Vivekananda, concluding the presentation of a paper at Chicago's Parliament of the World's Religions in 1893, to call upon the blessings of he who is the Brahman of the Hindus, the Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Buddha of the Buddhists, the Jehovah of the Jews, and the Father in heaven of the Christians. To him they were one and the same, that which exists is one. The sages call it by various names, seeing life whole. The British, who in their 2 centuries of imperial rule over India struggled to understand and come to terms with Hinduism, did a great deal to explore and debate its meanings as best they could. Some saw it, in E.M. Forster's notorious phrase, as a mystery in a muddle. Others tried to reduce it to terms they could relate to. Whether Hinduism was polytheistic or monotheistic was a question that agitated many British minds. After the census of 1911, one senior British official concluded that the great majority of Hindus have a firm belief in one supreme god Parmeshvar, Ishvara, or Narayana. The chief British census official in India, Sir Herbert Risley, observed that these ideas are not the monopoly of the learned, they are shared in great measure by the man on the street. An intelligent Hindu peasant, he claimed, not only was familiar with Hindu concepts like the Paramatma, Supreme Soul, Karma, loosely translatable as fate, Maya, illusion, Mukti, salvation, and so on, but had a rough working theory of their bearing upon his own future. Point 5. A few basic ideas were deeply ingrained into every Hindu, whether he lived up to them or not. Among these commonly held beliefs were two fourfold divisions. The first was the organization of life into 4 stages, or ashramas. These were Brahmacharya, the bachelor existence, a time to be spent learning and acquiring mastery over the essential disciplines needed to lead a meaningful life. Then Grihastha, the life of a householder, when one married, procreated, and assumed the responsibilities of family life. Then Vanaprastha, when one retired and retreated to the forest to lead a life of contemplation in harmony with nature. And finally, Sannyas, the stage of renunciation of all worldly ties, at which one seeks one's ultimate merger with Brahman, the spirit suffusing the cosmos. The 4 stages of life also related to the 4 ends of life, the Purusharthas, that every Hindu had to pursue, Dharma, the moral code, discussed more fully later, Artha, prosperity or material well-being, Kama, desire for pleasure and gratification, and ultimately moksha, or the salvation that comes from ultimate self-realization, the fulfillment of which is the purpose of each individual life. These stages and ends of life in Hinduism embraced an all-encompassing idea of human needs in a comprehensive vision. Every person needs to learn and to earn, to have sex, food, and money, to love, to nurture, to assume responsibility. Each individual also has a shared concern for the common good and an indefinable curiosity about the unseen, about that which can only be experienced and not understood through words. All of these urges coexist in all of us. They overlap and interact with each other. We pursue them systematically or randomly, or we stumble across them, but they are present in each of our lives in an interdependence of which we are barely conscious but which the Hindu rishis fully appreciated. The common expression, Mata, Pita, Guru, Devam, encapsulates the human journey. One is first, from birth, totally dependent on the mother, then exposed to the outer world by the father, then taught and guided by the Guru, until one finally finds God. The Hindu appreciation of life saw it whole, recognized the supreme ends of life and the stages needed to progress towards their achievement. It did not seek to suppress or deny the normal lust for sex, wealth, or possessions, but sublimated these in a larger purpose. Kama even has its own Shastra, Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra. Hinduism accommodated the acknowledgement of worldly desires within the quest for the eternal. As Radhakrishnan postulated, Hinduism binds together the kingdoms of earth and heaven. Indeed, it is no coincidence that Hindu gods are all married. They are depicted with consorts, each of whom, like the gods and goddesses themselves, have multiple aspects and manifestations. It is a striking feature of Hinduism that our gods can be susceptible to desire. They are depicted falling for apsaras and seducing sages' wives. Lord Shiva even fell for Vishnu in the transformed appearance of the ethereally beautiful Mohini. Prudery appears to have been imported into Hindu social attitudes only in reaction to the Muslim invasions and Victorian colonial rule. Hindus pursue their quest for the eternal, the search for the light beyond the darkness, through 3 types of activity: Jnana, or the quest for knowledge, not merely theoretical learning but in the form of realized experience which leads to wisdom; Bhakti, or devotion, expressed principally through prayer, fasting, temple rituals and sacrifice, but also through meditation and self-interrogation; and Karma, or action and service in the fulfillment of Dharma. Karma is a concept that is variously translated as action, fate, or destiny, and causality. It means all 3, though the meaning depends on the context in which the phrase is used. Bhakti is of course the most popular path, and the easiest for most people to pursue, since a capacity for worship comes inborn in all of us. Purists categorize Hindu worship in a taxonomy that runs like this: The most simple Hindus worship spirits and animist forces. The next level of ordinary Hindus worship their own ancestors, popular deities, and gurus or godmen. The level above that worships incarnations like Rama, Krishna, or Buddha. Above this level are those who worship a personal god, or Ishtadevta, and highest of all are those Hindus who worship the Absolute, in the form of Brahman. Those who worship the Ishtadevta or personal Bhagwan, in other words those trying to reach Brahman through a divine intermediary, must settle for a somewhat lower place in the hierarchy of spiritual yearning than those who seek Brahman for itself, in the quest for ultimate self-realization. A verse from the Kena Upanishad 6 captures some of the exquisite literary talents of the ancients along with the profundity of their philosophical inquiry. Who sends the mind to wander afar? Who first drives life to start on its journey? Who impels us to utter these words? Who is the spirit behind the eye and the ear? It is the ear of the ear, the eye of the eye, and the word of words, the mind of mind, and the life of life. Those who follow wisdom pass beyond end, on leaving this world, become immortal. There the eye goes not, nor words, nor mind. We know not, we cannot understand, how he can be explained. He is above the known and he is above the unknown. Thus have we heard from the ancient sages who explained this truth to us. What cannot be spoken with words, but that whereby words are spoken, know that alone to be Brahman, the spirit, and not what people here adore. What cannot be thought with the mind, but that whereby the mind can think, know that alone to be Brahman, the spirit, and not what people here adore. What cannot be seen with the eye, but that whereby the eye can see, know that alone to be Brahman, the spirit, and not what people here adore. What cannot be heard with the ear, but that whereby the ear can hear, know that alone to be Brahman, the spirit, and not what people here adore. What cannot be indrawn with breath, but that whereby breath is indrawn, know that alone to be Brahman, the spirit, and not what people here adore. Into all of this, great variations and choices enter. Some critics have described Hinduism as animism tempered by philosophy, or mysticism leavened by metaphysics. They are not wholly right, but they are not wrong either. Ultimately, all such worship is merely a means to an end. Some look for God in nature, in forests and rivers, some in images of wood or stone, and some in the heavens, but the Hindu sage looks for God within, and finds him in his own deeper self. The banyan tree of Hinduism. As a result of this openness and diversity, Hinduism is a typically Indian growth, a banyan tree. It spreads its branches far and wide, and these in turn sink back into the earth to take fresh root in the welcoming soil. In the shade of the vast canopy of this capacious banyan tree, sustained by multiple roots and several trunks, a great variety of flora and fauna, thought and action, flourishes. The multiplicity of places of worship in India gives Hindus plenty of choice, and affords religious-minded temple-goers opportunities for extensive pilgrimages. Most Hindu families embark on these quite often. For some, the only holidays they undertake are to temple towns, to worship at the shrine of a powerful deity. While some pilgrimages, especially to well-established temple towns, take on the characteristics of a religious holiday, others can be quite arduous. The annual yatra to the ice cave at Amarnath in Kashmir involves a major trek, that of Mount Kailash and Lake Mansarovar in Tibet, renowned as the abode of Shiva, has cost the lives of many of who have attempted it across the narrow and treacherous Himalayan passes. Pilgrimages to Kedarnath and Badrinath, and to the sources of the Ganga and the Yamuna at Gangotri and Yamunotri respectively, are other Himalayan journeys that are not for the weak or faint-hearted. Other religious trips are to sites where large numbers of Hindus gather for a special occasion, from the Thrissur Puram, an annual festival which involves the largest processional of caparisoned elephants in the world, usually up to 100 pachyderms decked up to the hilt, to the Rathayatra at the Jagannath Temple in Puri, Odisha, and the Kumbh Melas described below. Utsavas, religious festivals, from the Sanskrit ut, to let go or remove, and sava, worldly sorrows, hence an occasion to release one's burdens or cares, abound across the country. Regional festivals witness throngs of worshippers in different parts of the country on different occasions at fixed times of the year. Bengalis celebrating Durga Puja, Maharashtrians Ganesh Chaturthi, the Ram Leela across North India, Onam in Kerala, Pongal in Tamil Nadu. Holi, the festival of colors, is famously the most fun-filled of all Utsavas, while an occasion like Makar Sankranti, marking the transit of the sun into the Makara Rashi, Capricorn sign of the zodiac, in Hindu astrology, is observed with due solemnity. The largest crowds gather during the Kumbh Melas that take place every 12 years in Haridwar, Allahabad, Prayag, Nasik, and Ujjain. The Allahabad Kumbh, at the confluence of the Ganga and the Yamuna, is an extraordinary sight, attracting some 20 million people each time. Sometimes a pilgrimage may consist of a regular visit to one favorite temple. The Kerala political leader K. Karunkaran traveled to the fabled Krishna temple in Guruvayur on the 1st of every month, according to the Malayalam calendar, throughout his long life, and thousands do the same to the hilltop shrine to Ayyappa at Sabarimalai, or to Balaji at Tirumalai. Sometimes it is to a particular area where many temples abound, the temples to the 9 planets at Kumbakonam, for instance. But quite often it can be an extensive circuit, such as the one my family undertook by car across southern India when I was 14, a 3-week journey that enabled us to pray at Tirupati, Madurai, whose famed Meenakshi temple, dedicated to a warrior queen who became a consort of Shiva, boasts 33,000 sculptures. Tanjavur, Kanchipuram, Polani, Ramaswaram and innumerable smaller towns in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, halting at each place just to worship at the principal temple, and moving on to the next one. My parents found this profoundly satisfying. For their children, it was all a bit of an adventure, though we learned a little about Hinduism at each stop. The striking thing to a young boy during this journey was the remarkable variety of these places of worship, the differences in their architectural styles and physical appearances, the different manifestations of God being worshipped at different temples, the variety of rituals and the behavior of the priests, the different materials presented as prasadam, offerings, to the gods, and the idiosyncratic practices associated with each shrine, most famously the shaving of the head at the Venkatachalpathi temple in Tirumalai, Tirupati, Andhra Pradesh, the richest temple in India 7 where my 14-year-old locks were duly shorn as an offering to Lord Balaji. The Hindu acceptance of variety goes much farther than this, however. Foreigners sometimes politely ask if Hinduism requires vegetarianism or abjures alcohol, and are puzzled when different Hindus give them different answers to the question. Versions of the faith come with their own prescriptions and proscriptions, but there is no universal requirement. There are Hindus, particularly Vaishnavas in the north, who recoil in horror at the very thought of consuming meat, and others who will not touch even garlic or onion, considered domesticate foods by purists, while there are Hindus who eat all of these and would consider it mildly uncivilized not to do so. Goats are routinely sacrificed at the Kali God temple in Kolkata and other animals at Kali temples across the land, but most Hindu religious occasions are marked by ostentatious vegetarianism. My children's mother is half Bengali, half Kashmiri, descended from a long line of carnivorous Brahmins on both sides who were alternately horrified and mournful about my vegetarianism. Some tried to excuse it on the grounds that I must be a Vaishnava, a worshipper of Vishnu, though I was too eclectic to be so typecast and had actually been named for Shiva, having been born on Mahashivaratri. But then in Tamil, the word for vegetarian is Shiva. Go figure. We brought up our sons to eat everything, but their mixed genetic inheritance prevailed. One twin took to meat eating with relish, while the other, at age 7, with no persuasion whatsoever from his father, turned staunchly vegetarian. Alcohol offers its own contradictions. There is a strain of prohibition in some aspects of Hindu thought, but this coexists with the use of alcohol in some religious rituals, such as at the Kal Bhairava temples, and indeed with the routine habit, of some sannyasis, of consuming marijuana and other hallucinogens in the pursuit of spiritual experiences. In the Vedas, soma, or samaras, was a favorite beverage of the Vedic deities, and much alcohol flowed during religious ceremonies and sacrifices. In the Rig Veda, Mandala 4, hymn 18, the god Indra is said to have drunk 3 lakes of soma to fortify himself before slaying the dragon Vritra, who had imprisoned all the waters of the world. 9 The Mahabharata is replete with details of alcohol consumed by those who are worshipped as incarnations of Vishnu. In Puranic mythology, there is a Hindu goddess of wine, Varuni, who emerged from the primordial churning of the ocean, the Samudramanthan, as one of 14 ratnas bestowed upon the world, including the moon. Sanskrit literature, including the poetry and plays of Kalidasa, India's greatest literary figure, even though only a fraction of his sublime work has survived, is replete with references to intoxicating drinks. Yet other texts also offer dharmashastric objections to Brahmins consuming liquor, and Brahminical Hinduism has tended to disapprove of alcohol consumption. There is doctrinal variety, as well. Those Hindus who are steeped in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, suffused with a sense of Brahman, the ultimate reality underlying all phenomena, pervading the cosmos and debating its unity with Atman, the universal soul also present in each of us, would consider themselves monotheists. The common man, innocent of such texts, might think of the multiple deities he sees around him as different gods, and have no difficulty with being considered a polytheist. The truth is that it doesn't matter. These are all equally valid ways of being a Hindu. This pervasive multiplicity of practices and beliefs makes it difficult to conceptualize Hinduism as one might other religions. As a term of description, indeed, Hindu implies no monolithic identity. To speak of the Hindu community, as one might the Muslim Ummah, is contestable, since Muslims are bound to each other by credos, convictions, and rules of which Hindus are innocent. The absence of standard practices and belief systems, and the absence of ecclesiastical hierarchies and universal religious institutions, adds to the difficulty. When Christians disagree amongst each other, they disagree with reference to the interpretation of one single book, the Bible, whose teachings remain the fountainhead of their faith. The same is true of Muslims, though the room for interpretation is less, since the Quran is seen as the revealed word of God, though the Hadith offers more room for discussion. Hinduism has no such handy volume. When Hindus seek guidance, it is rarely to textual authority that they turn, though often to spiritual guides or gurus, whose knowledge, at least in theory, may be derived from their understanding of various scriptures. In recent times, the Bhagavad Gita has become the equivalent of a sacred book for the Hindus, due to its frequent use by 20th century gurus such as Swami Chinmayananda and political leaders like Mahatma Gandhi. The Gita subsumes the ideals of the Vedas and Upanishads in the words of the popular deity Krishna, and its exhortation to do one's duty irrespective of the consequences has been cited as an inspiration by various figures on the world stage, from Turkish Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit to justify his country's invasion of Cyprus, to my failed candidacy for the Secretary Generalship of the United Nations. But Hinduism cannot be reduced to the Bhagavad Gita, or any single holy book. Dr. Radhakrishnan put it best. To him, Hinduism is not a definite dogmatic creed, but a vast, complex, but subtly unified mass of spiritual thought and realization. The spiritual leader Dada Vaswani calls Hinduism variously a fellowship of faiths, a federation of philosophies, and a league of religions. Note the plural in that last word. Indeed, the writer Rudvij Merchant adapted a phrase of mine to make the point. I had written in my book, India, From Midnight to the Millennium, that any truism about India can be immediately contradicted by another truism about India. He observed that Hinduism appears to be very much like India, an essential paradox, as any attempt at a truism about Hinduism can be immediately contradicted by another truism about Hinduism. Remarking that there are as many Hinduisms as there are adherents, he goes on to add, interestingly, Shashi Tharoor's statement about India, that the singular thing about the country is that you can only speak about it in the plural, applies to Hinduism perfectly. If religion is seen as a technology that can be leveraged to grow spiritually and eventually achieve union with the Supreme, there appears to be no uniformity or synchronization to the Hindu way. Indeed, the term, the Hindu way, is in itself a fallacy, as there is no one Hindu way. 10. Merchant interestingly defines a Hindu as one who is an ardent seeker of truth, an individual who strives to actively discern the existence of the objective reality otherwise termed as God and attain him if convinced of his existence, using means that are inherently subjective and dependent on the individual's own proclivities, beliefs, and values, is a Hindu. This definition of Hinduism, if it can be called that, since it could apply to almost anyone of any culture or religious faith, emphasizes the individualist nature of the quest for truth, the role of reasoning in the process, and the ultimate yearning for God. Whether one uses that term or speaks of the soul's merger with Brahman, the idea is the same. Some Hindus reject the term Hindu altogether as a description of their faith, preferring to speak of Brahmanism, though this is used by some Dalits and others as a term of abuse against the Brahmins who have dominated the faith. But in its origins, the expression refers to the ideal of attaining the Brahman, the universal spirit that suffuses the cosmos. Many use the Sanskrit Hindi phrase, Sanatana Dharma, or eternal faith, though faith, as I explain shortly, is an inadequate translation of Dharma. Sanatana is eternal in the sense that it refers to a Dharma that is old and new at the same time, ever present, and ever evolving. In Hinduism, there is no difficulty in accepting that some aspects of Dharma will be rendered irrelevant over the eons, and that other ideas, innovations, and reforms will be infused into the faith and rejuvenated. The essence of Dharma, however, remains unchanged throughout eternity. The Hindu concept of time is very different from Western ideas. In Hindu thought, the world has no beginning and no end, but only experiences endless repetitive cycles of time in 4 yugas, eons or ages: Satya Yuga, the age of truth; Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga; and Kali Yuga, the age of destruction and untruth, the one in which we are all living now. Each Kali Yuga ends with a great flood, Pralaya, that destroys the world, only to start afresh with a new Satya Yuga. Some Hindus argue that Vaishnavites and Shaivites differ in their perception of time. After all, Vishnu is reincarnated in various avatars, while Shiva simply is. Vaishnavites, in this reading, are constantly changing through time, while Shaivites are focused on the annihilation of the self. Though the distinction is interesting, both sets of Hindus relate to time very differently from followers of other faiths, whose temporal existence on this earth culminates, after death, in paradise or hellfire. I mentioned earlier that dharma is often translated as faith, and that this is an inadequate translation. The concept of dharma is much broader, embracing an entire system of social ethics covering law-abiding conduct. Indeed, in an afterword to the great Indian novel in 1989, I listed a whole series of meanings that have been ascribed to the term dharma, an untranslatable Sanskrit word that is, nonetheless, breezily defined as an unitalicized entry in many an English dictionary. The Chambers 20th Century Dictionary, for example, defines it as the righteousness that underlies the law. A passable effort, to be sure, but no one-word translation in English, faith, religion, law, can convey the full range of meaning implicit in the term. English has no equivalent for dharma, writes P. Lell, defining dharma as code of good conduct, pattern of noble living, religious rules, and observance. Nanditha Krishna, author of several popular books on various aspects of Hinduism, translates dharma as law of righteousness. In his book The Speaking Tree, Richard Lanoy actually defines dharma in 9 different ways in different contexts. These include moral law, spiritual order, sacred law, righteousness, and even the sweeping totality of social, ethical and spiritual harmony. Indeed, dharma in its classic sense embraces the total cosmic responsibility of both God and man. My late friend Ansar Hussain Khan, author of the polemical The Rediscovery of India, suggested that dharma is most simply defined as that by which we live. The word dharma is formed from the Sanskrit root dhr, to hold. Dharma is therefore that which holds a person or object and maintains it in existence. It is the law that governs its being. To live according to dharma is to be in consonance with the truth of things. A moral life, for a Hindu, is a life lived in accordance with his dharma, which in turn must be in conformity with the absolute truth that encompasses the universe.